The bass hit like a physical force, thumping through the floorboards and vibrating up through Marcus's chest as he lay on his back under table 17. The distortion was killing him. Somebody had cranked the gain too high on channel 3, and now every kick drum hit came through the speakers like wet cardboard tearing. He'd been chasing the problem for 20 minutes, tracing cables through a maze of linen-draped catering tables while the gala prep swirled around him. Dad. Lily didn't look up from her coloring. Did Mom like parties like this? The question landed somewhere between his ribs. He kept his hands moving on the cable, checking the connection with his multimeter, buying himself a beat. Your mom liked music, he said. She would have had opinions about this sound system, that's for sure. What kind of opinions? The kind where she'd find the person responsible and make them explain their life choices. Lily snorted, a small unguarded sound that cracked something open in his chest every time he heard it. She was 7 now. Dana had been gone for 4 years. The math never got easier. The St. Matthew's Hospital Charity Gala was the biggest event Marcus's AV company had booked all year, and he'd almost turned it down when he saw the venue was the hospital's grand ballroom. Hospitals had a smell, a particular antiseptic sharpness that brought back too many memories, not of Dana's last days, but of the months before, the misdiagnoses, the doctors who'd looked at a black woman describing her symptoms and seen anxiety instead of the tumor that was already spreading. But the money was good, and Lily's orthodontist wasn't going to pay himself, so here they were. He heard her before he saw her. The sharp click of heels on marble, the particular rhythm of someone who expected the floor to rise up and meet her shoes. Victoria Sterling stepped through the double doors at the far end of the ballroom, and the energy in the room shifted. Not because anyone stopped working, they worked faster. She wore a navy blue dress that probably cost more than 3 months of Marcus's rent, her hair pulled back in a style that looked simple but required someone else's hands to achieve. Her son Ethan walked beside her, a boy of about 9 in a perfectly fitted charcoal suit, his posture already carrying the particular stiffness of a child who'd been taught that shoulders should never round. Victoria didn't walk through the room. She inspected it. Her eyes swept the tables, and Marcus watched her pause at table 12, reach down, and adjust a soup spoon by perhaps 1/4 of an inch. She spoke into the earpiece she wore, her voice low and unhurried, and somewhere across the room an assistant flinched and started moving faster. Marcus had seen this type before, not in person, but in the way the world talked about them. The kind of woman who'd built an empire and expected the empire to behave accordingly. The lady in the blue dress looks important, Lily whispered. She's the one paying for all this. Is she nice? Marcus considered the question. Victoria Sterling had raised more money for St. Matthew's pediatric wing than anyone in the hospital's history. She'd also, according to the event coordinator who'd hired Marcus, made 3 separate staff members cry during the planning process. She's efficient, he said. Lily seemed to accept this answer. She went back to her unicorn, and Marcus went back to his cables, and for a few minutes the world was just the two of them in their small pocket of quiet beneath the table. Ethan Sterling spotted Lily before Marcus realized what was happening. The boy had been trailing his mother with the resigned patience of a child who'd attended too many galas, his hands in his pockets and his gaze wandering. When it landed on the small figure sitting cross-legged beneath table 17, he stopped walking. Victoria kept moving, already focused on the next imperfection, and Ethan made a choice. He walked over. "Hi," he said, squatting down to Lily's level. "What are you drawing?" Lily looked up, startled but not shy. She'd never been shy, that was all Dana, and held up her coloring book. "A unicorn. But I'm making the horn silver instead of gold because silver is better." "Why is silver better?" "Because gold is what everyone expects." Ethan considered this with the seriousness of a small philosophy professor, then nodded. "That makes sense." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stopwatch, the old-fashioned kind with a metal case and a button on top. Want to see something cool? Lily put down her crayon. What is it? It's a stopwatch. My grandfather gave it to my dad, and my dad gave it to me. Watch. He clicked the button, and the second hand started sweeping around the face. You can time things. Anything. I've been timing how long it takes my mom to find something wrong with each table. Lily's eyes went wide. How long? 47 seconds for table 12. That's her record so far. From his position under the table, Marcus watched the exchange. Ethan's voice had the particular enthusiasm of a kid who'd found someone his own age in a room full of adults, and Lily was leaning forward, her flashlight forgotten, her whole body oriented toward this new person who'd appeared in her orbit. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a loosening, maybe, or the opposite of the tightness he'd been carrying since they walked through the hospital doors. Then Victoria's voice cut through the ballroom. Ethan. The boy's shoulders went rigid. He stood up, pocketing the stopwatch. I have to go. Nice to meet you. Victoria Sterling's scream didn't sound like the kind of scream that belonged in a ballroom. It was raw, unpolished, the kind of noise that came from somewhere deeper than performance, and it cut through the string quartet's crescendo like a blade through silk. The music stuttered. A violinist lost her place. Every head in the room turned toward the stage, and for one suspended second, the gala became a photograph, champagne flutes frozen mid-clink, mouths half open. Victoria was already moving. Her heels caught the edge of the red carpet runner, and she stumbled, one hand shooting out to catch herself on a chair back, the other still reaching toward the small body crumpled on the marble floor. Ethan. He'd been standing right beside her, holding that stopwatch, and now he wasn't standing at all. He was on his back, arms splayed, the stopwatch still clutched in his right hand, its second hand frozen at 37 seconds. The same 37 seconds it had taken for everything to go wrong. Marcus was on his feet before his brain caught up with his legs. The screwdriver he'd been holding clattered to the floor, and somewhere in the back of his mind he registered Lily's small gasp, the way her fingers tightened on the edge of the tablecloth, but his eyes were locked on Ethan. The boy's chest wasn't moving right. The hospital's medical team moved fast, but not fast enough. Marcus watched them push through the crowd, two paramedics in navy blue uniforms, a nurse with a crash cart, and behind them, moving with the deliberate calm of a man who'd seen too many emergencies to be rattled by one more, Dr. Richard Calloway. White hair, steady hands, the kind of face that belonged on a medical school brochure. He knelt beside Ethan and started issuing orders. Heart rates all over the place, one of the paramedics said, his fingers on Ethan's wrist. BP's dropping. 90/60 and falling. He's got a rash, the nurse added, pulling back Ethan's collar to reveal a spreading red bloom across his neck and jawline. Looks like anaphylaxis. Calloway nodded, already reaching for the epinephrine. Allergic reaction. Could be something he ate, could be environmental. Get me in 4-line and prep 0.3 milligrams of AP, intramuscular, right thigh. Marcus watched from the hallway. They'd moved Ethan behind the glass partition that separated the ballroom from the emergency treatment bay, a small, sterile room that the hospital kept ready for exactly this kind of situation, because galas at St. Matthew's had a reputation for excess, and excess sometimes came with consequences. Through the glass, Marcus could see everything, the crash cart, the monitors, the 4-stand, and the screen that displayed Ethan's heart rhythm in glowing green lines. He'd spent enough years reading those lines to know what they were supposed to look like. And what they weren't. The T-wave was wrong. Not the wrong of a body in allergic shock. The wrong of a heart misfiring at the electrical level. Marcus had seen it exactly twice before. Once in a 19-year-old private who'd taken a baseball bat to the chest during a training exercise, commotio cordis, the doctors called it, a disruption of the heart's electrical system caused by blunt impact at precisely the wrong millisecond. And once in Dana. Lily tugged at his jacket. "Daddy, is he going to be okay?" Her voice was small, the way it got when she was trying very hard not to be scared. Marcus looked down at her wide brown eyes, at the unicorn coloring book still clutched under her arm, at the silver crayon she'd been so proud of, and he wanted to tell her yes. He wanted to tell her that the doctors had it under control, that Ethan would be fine, that the world was the kind of place where little boys didn't collapse at charity galas and never get back up. But he couldn't. Because he'd told Dana the same thing 3 years ago, in a different emergency room, with different doctors, and he'd been wrong. The memory hit him like it always did, uninvited, unwelcome, and impossible to ignore. Dana in the hospital bed, her hand cold in his, the monitor beeping out a rhythm that made no sense. Just anxiety, the doctor had said, a young man with a clipboard and the kind of confidence that came from never having been wrong before. Her heart's fine. We'll keep her overnight for observation, but there's nothing to worry about. Marcus had stood there, Lily asleep in his arms, and he'd looked at the monitor and seen the same T-wave abnormality he was seeing now. He'd known, in some deep and wordless part of himself, that the doctor was missing something. But he hadn't said anything. He'd trusted the white coat, the credentials, the system. 47 minutes later, Dana's heart had stopped, and by the time they got it started again, the woman he'd married was gone and only the shell remained. He hadn't trusted anyone else's expertise since. Inside the treatment bay, Calloway administered the second dose of epinephrine. Still no improvement, the nurse said, her voice tight. Heart rate's becoming erratic. I'm seeing ventricular fibrillation. Marcus's jaw clenched. V-fib. The heart wasn't beating anymore, it was quivering, a bag of worms, pumping nothing. He knew the timeline. 3 minutes until brain damage became a real possibility. 5 minutes until it became likely. 10 minutes until the boy was gone for good, another name on a list of people who died because someone in charge had made the wrong call. The emergency room doors didn't open so much as surrender when Marcus pushed through them. The security guard behind the desk, a tired-looking man with gray at his temples and the kind of posture that came from 20 years of night shifts, looked up and opened his mouth to say something about authorized personnel only. Then he saw Marcus's face, and whatever words he'd been about to speak died in his throat. Some expressions didn't need translation. Some expressions said "get out of my way" in a language older than words. Marcus walked past the desk without breaking stride. Lily was somewhere behind him in the waiting area, clutching her unicorn coloring book, because he'd told her to stay put and she was 7 years old and she listened to her father even when her father's voice had gone strange and tight in a way she'd never heard before. He would make that up to her later. Right now, there was no later. There was only the treatment bay, visible through the glass partition, and the green lines on the monitor that were telling him a story he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. The story was this: a heart was dying, and the people trying to save it were killing it faster. Calloway had just pushed the third dose of epinephrine when Marcus entered the bay. The attending nurse, a young black woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun and sweat beading along her hairline, saw him first. Her hand moved toward the call button on instinct, but she didn't press it. Something about the way Marcus moved through the room made people reconsider their instincts. "Stop the epinephrine," Marcus said. His voice came out low and even, the kind of voice that didn't ask for permission because it didn't occur to the person speaking that permission was required. "Now. You're making it worse." Calloway turned. The attending physician was a man in his late 40s with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now just sharp, all angles and impatience. His eyes swept over Marcus, the maintenance uniform, the name stitched on the chest pocket, the hands that still had grease under the fingernails from working under table 17, and what he saw clearly didn't match what he was hearing. "Who the hell are you?" Calloway demanded. "Security. Look at the monitor." Marcus pointed at the screen, and something in the gesture, the precision of it, the absolute certainty, made Calloway's mouth close. "You're treating for anaphylaxis. You've pushed 3 rounds of AP and his heart is fibrillating worse with every dose. That's not an allergic reaction. Look at the T wave." The room went still. Not the still of compliance, the still of confusion, of a system encountering something it didn't have a protocol for. Victoria Sterling stood on the other side of the bed, her gown streaked with blood from where she'd caught Ethan when he collapsed, her makeup a ruin of mascara and tears. She looked at Marcus with something that was equal parts hope and fury, the expression of a woman who had spent the last 12 minutes watching her son die and was now being told by a janitor that the doctors were wrong. "Who are you?" she whispered. The question came out cracked, barely audible over the beeping of the monitors. Marcus didn't answer her. He was already moving toward the screen, his eyes fixed on the waveform that was painting its deadly picture in phosphor green. "Commotio cordis," he said. "Blunt impact to the chest at the wrong millisecond of the cardiac cycle. It disrupts the electrical system, sends the heart into fibrillation. But that's not the whole story." His finger traced the ST segment on the screen. "You see this elevation? And here, the T wave inversion. That's not commotio cordis by itself. That's commotio cordis on top of a congenital defect. An atrial septal defect, if I'm reading this right. A hole in the heart that nobody ever caught." Calloway's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: dismissal, hesitation, and then something that looked almost like recognition. Not of Marcus, he'd never seen this man before in his life, but of the pattern Marcus was describing. The pieces clicking into place. "You're a doctor?" Calloway asked. "Electrician," Marcus said. "But I used to be a combat medic. 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. I've seen this twice before. Once in a private who took a baseball bat to the chest during a training exercise. Once in my wife, 3 years ago, when a team of doctors just like you kept pushing epinephrine while I stood there and watched her heart give out because I didn't say anything." The last sentence landed like a physical blow. Victoria made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and her hand flew to her mouth. Calloway's jaw tightened. The nurse with the tight bun, whose name tag read Henderson, was already reaching for the ultrasound machine without being asked. "You've got maybe 2 minutes before that heart muscle is too damaged to recover," Marcus said. "Cut the AP. Get me an echo. And prep the defibrillator. If I'm right about the ASD, you're going to need to cardiovert, not just shock." 5 seconds of silence. The longest 5 seconds Marcus had felt since the night Dana died. Calloway stood frozen, his training warring with his ego, his authority challenged in front of his team by a man who fixed sound systems for a living. The monitor kept beeping. Ethan's heart kept quivering. Victoria kept staring at Marcus like he was either a miracle or a monster and she hadn't decided which. Then Calloway said, "Get the echo." Henderson moved. The news vans arrived before the sun did. At 5:47 a.m., 4 of them pulled up to the hospital's main entrance, their satellite dishes rising against the pre-dawn sky like skeletal flowers. The first headline hit the web at 5:52, "Unlicensed janitor performs emergency medical procedure on billionaire's son." By 6:15, it had mutated into something sharper: electrician posing AS doctor intervenes IN child's cardiac arrest, hospital investigating. Marcus saw none of this. He was sitting in a plastic chair in the pediatric ICU waiting room, still wearing the same uniform he'd put on 16 hours earlier, the knees of his pants darkened from kneeling on the ballroom floor. Lily sat cross-legged on the chair beside him, her small fingers wrapped around a silver stopwatch, the one Ethan had pressed into her palm the night before, his voice barely above a whisper, "Hold this for me. I'll come back for it." The stopwatch was still running. Lily had refused to stop it. Marcus's phone buzzed at 6:22 a.m. The caller ID read Franklin, his foreman at Metro Sound and Security. Marcus. Franklin's voice was tight, the way it got when a client was threatening to sue and he had to figure out who to throw under the bus. Tell me you didn't do what they're saying you did. Depends on what they're saying. They're saying you walked into a hospital, overrode a team of doctors, and performed a medical procedure on a minor. They're saying you're not a doctor. They're saying, Franklin stopped. They're saying you're suspended, Marcus. Effective immediately. Pending investigation. For how long? Marcus asked. I don't know. Marcus, what the hell happened last night? Marcus looked at Lily. She was studying the stopwatch, her thumb tracing the engraved initials on the back. Yes, Ethan Sterling. She just held the stopwatch and watched the seconds tick forward, as if keeping time was a promise she'd made and intended to keep. I saw something I recognized, Marcus said. And I didn't stay quiet this time. The line went silent for a long moment. When Franklin spoke again, his voice was softer. This time. But Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. The story was too long, too heavy, and there was a 4-year-old girl sitting next to him who didn't need to hear about the last time her father had stood in a hospital room and watched someone he loved die because he trusted the system to know better than he did. I'll call you when I know more, Franklin said finally. And Marcus? Whatever happens with the company, I want you to know this isn't coming from me. I know, Marcus said. It never does. He hung up and sat there, the phone warm in his hand, the waiting room empty except for the two of them and a vending machine that hummed in the corner like it was trying to fill the silence. Lily shifted in her chair, her head finding the crook of his arm. Is Ethan going to be okay? She asked. Marcus didn't have an answer for that. He didn't have answers for anything anymore, not for the suspension, not for the news vans, not for the way the hospital had gone quiet around them the moment someone in administration had figured out who he was and what he'd done. The nurses still smiled at him, but their smiles had changed. They were the smiles of people who'd been told not to talk to him. At 8:47 a.m., a woman in a gray suit appeared in the doorway of the waiting room. She had the posture of someone who delivered bad news for a living and had stopped feeling anything about it years ago. Mr. Johnson. I'm Patricia Okonkwo, Director of Hospital Administration. Dr. Calloway and the Disciplinary Committee would like to speak with you now. The conference room was on the 4th floor, far from the pediatric wing, far from any place where the sound of children crying might interrupt the business of institutional self-preservation. 5 people sat behind a long table, Calloway at the center, his face unreadable, the chief of internal medicine, a woman with silver hair and the kind of glasses that cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, 2 attorneys from the hospital's legal department, and a man Marcus didn't recognize, introduced only as Dr. Reeves from the State Medical Board. There was a single chair facing them. Marcus sat in it, his hands on his thighs, his back straight in the way that had been drilled into him during basic training and never quite left. The video played first. Someone had pulled the security footage from the ER bay, and there he was on a flat screen mounted to the wall, Marcus Johnson in his Metro Sound uniform, pushing past the security guard, his face set in that particular expression of a man who had stopped asking permission. The audio was missing, but the images told the story clearly enough. Marcus at Ethan's bedside, Marcus pointing at the monitor, Marcus's hands moving in the air as he explained something to Calloway that Calloway clearly didn't want to hear. The footage speaks for itself, said one of the attorneys, a thin man with a wedding ring that looked too tight for his finger. You're not a licensed physician. You're not a nurse practitioner. You're not even a paramedic. You're an electrician who entered a restricted medical area and interfered with active treatment of a minor patient. Do you understand the legal implications of what you've done? Marcus looked at him. Then he looked at Calloway, who was staring at the table like it held the answers to questions he hadn't figured out how to ask yet. I understand that boy would be dead if I hadn't, Marcus said. The silver-haired woman, Dr. Nakamura, according to the nameplate, leaned forward. That's a very serious claim, Mr. He pulled into the same space, third level, row D, spot 14, and killed the engine but didn't move. His hand stayed on the steering wheel, and he watched them shake in the fluorescent light that buzzed overhead like a trapped insect. The silence in the car was broken by a small voice from the back seat. Daddy? Lily was there. Of course she was there. She'd refused to stay with Mrs. Chen from downstairs, had looked at him with those eyes that were Dana's eyes and said, "I'm coming with you," in a tone that didn't allow for negotiation. She was 7 years old and she'd already learned that the world took things from you when you weren't watching, and she wasn't going to let it take her father without a fight. "I'm awake," she said, though her voice was thick with sleep. "I've been awake the whole time." Marcus turned in his seat to look at her. She was sitting in the middle of the back row, her seatbelt still fastened, her favorite sneakers, the ones with the rainbow laces that Dana had bought her 2 weeks before she died, kicking gently against the seat in front of her. She had her mother's chin, her mother's stubbornness, her mother's way of looking at you like she could see all the way through to the parts of yourself you were trying to hide. "Daddy," she said again, and this time her voice was clearer, sharper, the voice of a child who'd spent too much time in hospitals and not enough time on playgrounds. "This time you're going to say something, right? You're not going to be quiet like you were with Mommy?" The question hit him in the chest like a physical blow. He'd never told Lily about that night, not the details, not the silence, not the way he'd stood in that hallway and let doctors make decisions that killed his wife because he'd been too afraid, too conditioned, too beaten down by a world that had spent his entire life telling him his voice didn't matter. But children knew things. They breathed in the air of their parents' grief and exhaled understanding without ever being taught. "Yeah," Marcus said, and his voice came out steadier than his hands. "Yeah, baby. This time I'm going to say something." He got out of the car. The garage air was cold and smelled of exhaust and antiseptic, the universal scent of hospitals everywhere. Lily climbed out behind him and took his hand without being asked, her small fingers sliding into his palm like they'd been designed to fit there. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor took 17 seconds. Marcus counted those too. Victoria Sterling was in the hallway outside the pediatric ICU, and for a moment Marcus didn't recognize her. The woman who had commanded a ballroom full of billionaires with the force of her presence alone was gone, replaced by someone smaller, someone broken. Her mascara had run in dark streaks down her cheeks. Her hair, which had been perfect the night before, hung in tangled ropes around her face. She was wearing the same dress she'd worn to the gala, and it was wrinkled now, stained with coffee and tears and the particular grime that accumulated on clothes that had been worn for too many hours in too many hard plastic chairs. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who had stopped hoping and was just going through the motions of being present because leaving felt like a betrayal she couldn't afford. "They said there's nothing else they can do," she said, and her voice was raw, scraped clean of the polish and power that usually coated every syllable. "They said his heart won't stabilize. They said," she stopped, swallowed, tried again. "They said they're going to call the time of death." Marcus didn't answer right away. He stood there in the hallway with his daughter's hand in his and Victoria Sterling's grief filling the space between them like smoke, and he thought about all the things he'd never said, all the times he'd been silent when he should have spoken, all the moments when his voice could have made a difference and he'd swallowed it down because the world had taught him that black men who talked back got labeled angry, got labeled difficult, got labeled dead. "Let me tell you about my wife," he said. Victoria blinked. It wasn't what she'd expected him to say, and for a second her grief paused, making room for confusion. Her name was Dana. She died 3 years ago in a hospital just like this one, with doctors just like the ones who are in there with your son right now. She died because they didn't listen. She died because they looked at her, a black woman with anxiety in her chart, and decided they already knew what was wrong before they ever ran a single test. She died because I was standing right there and I knew what was happening and I didn't say anything. He paused, felt Lily's hand tighten around his fingers. I was a combat medic. 2 tours in Afghanistan. I've seen more cardiac trauma than most of the doctors in this building. I knew what a failing mitral valve looked like. I knew the symptoms, I knew the patterns, I knew what the echo would show if anyone bothered to run it. But I didn't say anything because I'd spent my whole life being told that people like me don't get to have opinions in places like this. Victoria was staring at him now, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open. She looked like a woman who was seeing him for the first time, not the electrician, not the maintenance worker, not the man who'd pushed past security and broken rules and made her son live when everyone else had been ready to let him die. The catheter slid home at 4:12 a.m., and the monitor above Ethan Sterling's bed changed its song. He stepped back from the table and let the pediatric cardiologist take over the final checks. Subcostal oblique, she said, and her voice carried the particular weight of someone who had just watched a thing she'd read about in journals but never seen performed live. You caught the second thrombus at an angle the standard views missed. Where did you learn that technique? Marcus was already pulling off his surgical cap. The elastic snapped against his wrist. Fallujah. 2007, we had a Marine who took shrapnel to the chest, and the portable ultrasound couldn't get a clean window through the rib cage. Our chief medic figured out that if you angled the probe here, he touched a spot just below his own sternum, and tilted it 45 degrees oblique, you could see the whole cardiac silhouette without the ribs getting in the way. Saved that Marine's life. I've never forgotten it. The Johnson Protocol, she said. That's what we're calling it. The report's already being written up for the Journal of Emergency Cardiology. Marcus didn't answer. He was already walking toward the door, already pulling off the second glove, already thinking about the plastic chair in the hallway where his daughter was probably still asleep with her head resting on her backpack and her hand curled around the stopwatch that belonged to a boy who was going to live now, who was going to wake up and grow up and become whoever he was supposed to become because someone had looked at the right angle at the right moment and refused to look away. The hallway outside the pediatric ICU was quiet in the way that hospital hallways get quiet at 4 in the morning, not peaceful, exactly, but suspended, like the building itself was holding its breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that particular frequency that made you feel like you were inside a machine, and the floor had been polished recently enough that Marcus could see his own reflection in the linoleum, a tall black man in surgical scrubs walking toward a woman who had not moved from her chair in 6 hours. Victoria Sterling looked up when she heard his footsteps, and the hope that flickered across her face was so raw, so unguarded, that Marcus had to look away for a second. This was not the woman who had commanded a ballroom. This was not the woman who had built an empire. This was a mother who had been waiting for someone to walk through a door and tell her whether her son was dead or alive. He's stable, Marcus said, and the word hit Victoria like a physical force. Her whole body seemed to fold inward, not collapsing but releasing, the way a clenched fist releases when the danger has passed. The procedure was successful. The secondary blockage was smaller than the first one, but it was in a dangerous location, that's why his heart couldn't stabilize. They placed a closure device through the catheter, right at the site of the defect. His rhythm's normal now. They're closing him up. Victoria opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. She had been a woman who always knew what to say, who wielded words like weapons and shields and keys to doors that other people couldn't even see, and now she had no words at all. Marcus sat down in the chair next to her, not close enough to be intrusive but close enough that she would know she wasn't alone. On the other side of him, Lily stirred in her sleep, her head sliding off her backpack and landing against his arm. He shifted automatically, the way parents do, adjusting his body to make a better pillow without waking up enough to think about it. I used to think, Victoria said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, that if you had enough money, enough power, enough influence, you could protect the people you love from anything. From everything. That's what I've spent my whole life building. A fortress. And tonight I watched my son almost die while I stood outside a room full of doctors who couldn't save him, and the only person who could was a man I tried to have arrested. Marcus didn't answer right away. He was watching Lily breathe, the slow rise and fall of her chest, the way her fingers had loosened around the stopwatch but hadn't let go. He thought about Dana, about the hospital room where she died, about all the things he hadn't said when saying them might have made a difference. Money's not nothing, he said. But it's not everything either. Sometimes the thing that saves you is just someone who knows how to look at the right angle. The weeks that followed did not unfold the way stories like this were supposed to unfold. There was no viral video. No GoFundMe that raised millions. No dramatic press conference where Victoria Sterling stood at a podium and declared Marcus Johnson a hero while cameras flashed and journalists scribbled notes and the world collectively decided to be better. Instead, there was paperwork. There were board meetings at Sterling Capital that Victoria attended with a new kind of focus, a sharpness that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings and everything to do with the question she kept asking: why did it take a maintenance worker to catch what our entire medical system missed? There were calls to hospital administrators, to insurance executives, to the heads of cardiac departments at 12 different teaching hospitals.